The chamber had no name anymore. Once, 3,000 years ago, it had been called the Hall of Convergence, the singular room in all the known galaxy where the 47 sovereign species of the Galactic Accord gathered to speak in one voice. Carved from the bones of a dead star, lit by the frozen light of 7 suns, its walls etched with the names of every war it had ended, every plague it had halted, every species it had welcomed into the family of the cosmos. Now it was simply called the room where everything changed, and it had not even happened yet. Arbiter Prime Thesivane of the Vorkai pressed 12 of her fingers flat against the obsidian council table, steadying herself. The Vorkai were not known for trembling. They were among the oldest species in the Accord, patient, cold-blooded in every sense, having survived 4 ice ages and 2 extinction events through sheer stubborn refusal to die. Thesivane herself was 900 years old and had voted on decisions that reshaped the trajectories of civilizations. She was trembling now. The transmission had arrived 17 hours ago, routed through the Accord's deepest relay network, a network that had never once been accessed without authorization in 11 centuries of operation. And yet somehow, impossibly, something had used it. Something had bypassed every firewall, every authentication layer, every quantum encrypted handshake developed by the finest minds of 14 species, and left a message. 11 words. Nothing more. We have been patient. Patience has limits. We are ready. The message was unsigned. It did not need to be. Everyone in that chamber, everyone with clearance above level 7, already knew who had sent it. The humans. 44 years ago, humanity had applied for admission to the Galactic Accord. The application had been received, catalogued, and quietly shelved. Humans were, by the metrics the Accord used to classify civilizations, barely Category 3, a young species, barely 1,000 years past their first crude spaceflight, still occasionally at war with themselves, still divided into hundreds of competing political entities. The Accord's admission threshold required Category 6 at minimum, a species that had achieved unified governance, abandoned planet-based resource conflicts, and demonstrated at least 3 centuries of cooperative interstellar activity. Humanity had none of these things. So the Accord had done what it always did with premature applications: acknowledged receipt, assigned a monitoring delegation, and moved on. The monitoring delegation had filed reports every year for 4 decades. Most of them were unremarkable. Humans built things. Humans argued with each other. Humans had a disturbing tendency to solve problems through methods that, frankly, made the xenobiologists uncomfortable. But nothing in those reports had triggered any of the 47 standard alarm thresholds, until 8 months ago, when the monitoring delegation had simply stopped responding. The last report had been 6 pages long. The first 5 pages were routine. The 6th page, the final page, was a single sentence, written in high Accord script, the formal language of official communication, in a hand that signature analysis confirmed belonged to Senior Monitor Vel Adric, a Thessalian with 30 years of field experience and a record of unimpeachable professionalism. The sentence read, "I think we made a terrible mistake." Then nothing. Silence for 8 months. Attempts to contact the delegation, 112. Responses received, 0. Attempts to send a retrieval team, 3. Retrievals completed, 0. The first team's ship had returned empty, with no crew, its navigation logs erased, and its hull scored by something the metallurgists still could not identify. The second team had sent a single burst transmission, static and 1 human word, which the translator had rendered as magnificent, before going dark. The third team had not even made it out of the relay corridor. So here they sat, 47 species staring at 11 words on a screen, and Arbiter Prime Thesivane was trembling, and the Hall of Convergence had no name anymore. And outside the station's viewports, the stars burned cold and indifferent, and somewhere out in the dark beyond the edge of mapped space, humanity was ready. The question that no one wanted to ask, but that every single being in that chamber was thinking, was this: ready for what? The lights went out. Not gradually. not with a flicker or a warning. All at once, every light source in the Hall of Convergence, the artificial suns in their ceiling mounts, the bioluminescent strips along the walls, the glow panels embedded in the council table, the emergency backup phosphors that were supposed to be physically impossible to disable, all of it extinguished simultaneously. For exactly 3 seconds, the oldest room in the known galaxy was completely dark. Then a single screen on the far wall lit up. It showed a ship. There was silence in that chamber for a very long time. Then High Counselor Emverith of the Dreth, a species not known for understatement, who had described the Accord's greatest ever military engagement as somewhat concerning, leaned forward in the dark and said very quietly, "What in every name of every god of every species in this room is that?" The ship on the screen had no frame of reference. That was the first problem. In deep space imaging, ships were always shown relative to something: a moon, a station, another vessel, a debris field. You needed context to understand scale. The Accord sensor buoys, which ringed the entire mapped galaxy in a web of 40 billion monitoring points, had been designed by species who understood this fundamental principle of visual comprehension. Whoever had sent this transmission had understood it too. They had placed the ship next to a planet. The planet was not small. Thesivane recognized it instantly. Vareth 4, the gas giant that anchored the Vareth system, a world 11 times the mass of the Accord's standard gravitational reference unit, a planet so large that 3 of the Accord's most developed colony worlds could fit inside it, with room to spare. Vareth before was used in Accord navigation charts as a waypoint specifically because it was visually unmistakable. Every navigator in the galaxy knew it. The ship was larger, not by a small margin, not by some technical quibble about measurement methodology or sensor calibration. The ship was simply, unambiguously, undeniably larger than Vareth 4, longer by a factor the sensor overlay calculated at approximately 1.3, wider across its midsection by a factor the system tried to render, before apparently deciding that the number was implausible and flagging it for review. Thesivane heard from somewhere to her left the sound of a Kolthani, a species whose emotional responses to overwhelming information manifested as involuntary photosynthesis, beginning to glow. She understood the feeling. The ship was not beautiful. She wanted to note that to remind herself of it because there was something about its sheer presence that the mind wanted to aestheticize, to make into something noble. It was not noble. It was brutal. It looked like something that had been designed by beings who had looked at the concept of a ship, understood its purpose completely, and then asked what would happen if they took that purpose to its absolute logical extreme, and then kept going. It was dark, not the reflective dark of polished metal or the absorptive dark of stealth coating, but a deep structural darkness, as if the hull itself was consuming light rather than simply failing to reflect it. Along its length, at irregular intervals, there were features that the Accord's classification systems were cycling through 17 different categories trying to identify: weapon mounts, engine arrays, communication arrays, hull reinforcement structures. The AI kept reassigning them, cycling through possibilities because nothing in its database matched. At the bow, if it had a bow, the ship was roughly symmetrical along 2 axes but not 3. There was a single point of light. It was white, and it was very bright, and it pulsed with a rhythm that the Accord's xenocommunication specialists were already frantically analyzing, looking for patterns. They found one immediately. It was a heartbeat. "How long?" Thesivane asked. Her voice was steady. She was proud of that. The chief technical analyst, a young Mevari named Solris, who had held the position for 3 years and who Thesivane had previously considered one of the most composed individuals she had ever met, looked up from his console with the expression of someone who had just been asked to explain color to a species without eyes. "How long what, Arbiter Prime?" "How long have they been building that?" Solris looked back at his console. He ran 3 separate queries. He checked the output twice. He appeared to briefly consider whether the appropriate professional response was to simply lie. Based on the materials analysis, assuming standard human manufacturing techniques which may not apply. Minimum 6 years. More likely based on the structural complexity. He paused. 12. Possibly 15. Silence. They've been building this, Thesivane said slowly. For the entire time we've been monitoring them. For the entire time we've been monitoring them, Solris confirmed. And possibly longer. We have no records of construction beginning, which means either our monitoring was insufficient or they didn't want us to see it. Yes, Arbiter Prime. The implications cascaded through the chamber like a stone dropped in still water. If the humans had hidden the construction of a ship this size from Accord monitoring for 15 years, then everything the Accord thought it knew about humanity's capabilities was wrong. If they were wrong about the capabilities, they were wrong about the timeline. If they were wrong about the timeline, they were wrong about the threat assessment. If they were wrong about the threat assessment, Embereth of the Dreth stood up. I move, he said in the formal voice he used for official motions, that we immediately invoke Article 17 of the Accord Charter and begin emergency defensive mobilization. Article 17, said Thesivane, has never been invoked. Correct. It requires unanimous consent. I'm aware. It authorizes the Accord to treat the triggering species as an existential threat and respond accordingly. I know what it says, said Embereth, and his voice broke on the last word in a way that Thesivane had never heard from him before, and that was when she understood how frightened he was, and when she understood how frightened he was, she understood how frightened she should be. What I am saying, Arbiter Prime, is that we are looking at a ship larger than a gas giant, built in secret, by a species we classified as Category 3, that has been sitting on our doorstep for God knows how long waiting for us to notice. And I would like very much to do something about it before it decides to do something about us. The screen changed. The image of the ship disappeared, replaced by a face. Human. Female. Perhaps 40 years old by human reckoning, with close-cropped gray hair and dark eyes and the kind of stillness that Thesivane associated with very dangerous things that had learned the value of patience. She was wearing a uniform, not the chaotic patchwork of different national militaries that the Accord's files showed humans typically wore, but a single, unified design, dark with gold accents. And on the chest, where humans typically placed their insignia, there was a symbol that Thesivane had never seen before. Not any nation's flag, not any corporation's logo, not any faction's mark. Something new. The woman looked at them for a moment without speaking. Then she said, in perfect high Accord script, without translation, without a device, in a language that had never been taught to any human the Accord had ever encountered. My name is Admiral Yara Ose. I represent the Unified Terran Directorate. We have a proposal for the Council. A pause. We are prepared to be reasonable. We hope you are as well. Another pause. You have 6 hours to respond. The screen went dark. Thesivane counted 47 species in that room, representing 600 billion sentient beings across 312 inhabited worlds. Not one of them spoke for a very long time. The emergency session lasted 4 hours, which left 2 hours of the Admiral's deadline. In those 4 hours, the Galactic Accord did what it had always done in moments of existential uncertainty. It argued. The Yathrani delegation argued that the ship was a bluff, that no species at humanity's demonstrated level of development could have produced something of that scale, and that therefore the image was fabricated, a psychological pressure tactic, designed to force concessions without actual capability to back them up. The Yathrani had a long history of exactly this sort of tactic themselves, which perhaps explained why they recognized it so readily. The Kolthani delegation, now actively photosynthesizing at a rate that was causing minor interference with nearby electronics, argued that it did not matter whether it was a bluff, because the ability to send a transmission like this through their security network, in their language, was itself sufficient evidence of capability to constitute a Category 6 threat response trigger, regardless of what the ship could or could not do. The Dreth led by Embereth argued for Article 17, loudly and repeatedly. The Mavari argued for immediate diplomatic contact and the formation of a new working committee. Three delegations argued simultaneously in three different directions for approximately 40 minutes before Thesivane silenced them all by doing something she had done exactly twice in 900 years of life. She shouted, "Enough! Silence. We will not vote on Article 17 tonight. We will not because Article 17 requires unanimous consent, and I will personally vote against it, which means it cannot pass. And I am telling you this now so that we do not waste another hour on a motion that is going to fail. Are we clear?" Emverith opened his mouth. "Are we clear?" He closed it. "Good. Now, I want information. Solris, and what do we actually know about the Unified Terran Directorate?" Chief Technical Analyst Solris had spent the 4 hours of argument doing what analysts do, analyzing. He had pulled every file in the Accord's database on humanity, cross-referenced it with the monitoring delegation's reports, flagged everything that had been tagged as anomalous or low priority, and assembled it all into a picture that he was not entirely comfortable presenting, but that he presented anyway, because that was his job. "The Unified Terran Directorate," Solris said, pulling up a holographic display that showed a political map of humanity's solar system and nearby space, "does not appear in our records prior to approximately 11 years ago. Before that point, our monitoring data shows the standard human political fragmentation. Hundreds of nation-states, dozens of interplanetary entities, several competing off-world colonial administrations. Then, approximately 11 years ago, the pattern changes. The holographic map shifted, simplified, compressed. Hundreds of political borders collapsed into one. Over a period of approximately 18 months, every human government on every human-inhabited world signed what their public records call the Terran Consolidation Accord. We flagged this at the time as a significant political development, but classified it as internal reorganization. Human governments consolidate and fragment regularly, and the monitoring delegation assessed that this consolidation would likely be temporary." A pause. "That assessment was apparently incorrect. The Directorate has been in continuous unified governance for 11 years, Thesivane said. 11 years, 4 months, and 17 days, Solris confirmed. Without a single significant internal conflict, without a single secession attempt, without— He stopped, looked at his display. "Without, as far as we can determine, a single publicly recorded political assassination." The silence this time had a different quality. "That's," Emverith began, "unprecedented for a species at their developmental stage," Solris said. "Yes. By our models, the probability of a species in humanity's historical conflict profile achieving this level of political unity without either significant authoritarian consolidation or external existential threat was approximately 0.03%. "Which one is it?" Thesivane asked. "We don't know. Their internal communications are encrypted beyond our current decryption capability. What we do know is that their resource allocation changed dramatically in the year following the consolidation, 40. And their public science output," Solris continued, "which we track through academic publication networks, shows an extraordinary acceleration in the same period, particularly in the fields of materials science, propulsion theory, and—" He hesitated. "And what they call existential risk management, which is, as near as our analysts can determine, a human academic field devoted to the study of how civilizations get destroyed." The room was very quiet. Thesivane leaned back in her chair and looked at the ceiling of the Hall of Convergence, the ceiling that had been carved from the bones of a dead star that had watched 3,000 years of galactic history play out beneath it. She thought about what she knew of humanity. She thought about what the monitoring reports had described. A species born into scarcity, forged by violence, shaped by millennia of conflict with each other and their environment, and the fundamental hostility of their world. A species that had clawed its way out of a gravity well on chemical explosions and sheer refusal to stay down. A species that had looked at a universe that did not care whether they lived or died, and had decided apparently that this was unacceptable. She thought about the moment. She knew the moment precisely because it was in the monitoring files, when humanity had first detected Accord communication signals. 14 years ago. The reaction in human public discourse had been immediate and overwhelming and, by accord xenopsychological standards, completely abnormal. The expected response to first confirmation of alien intelligence was some combination of awe, fear, existential crisis, and diplomatic overture. Humanity had done all of those things, and then, apparently, they had kept going. Because 14 years ago was 3 years before the consolidation, which meant the consolidation had come after the discovery, which meant Solris, Thesivane said. What was the stated rationale for the Terran Consolidation Accord? A pause while he searched. The public documentation is extensive but largely symbolic. The core text cites, and I'm translating here, the recognition that humanity's future is singular, that our survival in a populated universe depends upon our capacity to speak with one voice, and that the time for internal division has passed. They unified, Thesivane said very slowly, because they found us. That appears to be the most accurate interpretation, yes. And then they spent 11 years building a ship, Emverith said, and his voice was strange now, stripped of its earlier anger, replaced by something that sounded almost like awe, larger than a gas giant, because they did not want to come to us as suppliants. Silence. They rejected, Thesivane said, and the thought was still forming as she spoke it. Our categories. We classified them as Category 3, and they classified themselves as what? What category are they? No one answered. Because there was no category for what humanity had apparently become. The doors to the Hall of Convergence opened. A single figure walked in. Not a hologram, not a transmission, a physical person. Human. Male. Tall. Wearing the same dark and gold uniform as the Admiral on the screen, with the same unfamiliar symbol on his chest. He was perhaps 60 years old, with the kind of face that had spent decades doing something very hard and had been shaped by it. He walked to the center of the chamber and stopped. He looked around the room at 47 species representing 600 billion beings. He said, "I am Ambassador Kiran Mehta of the Unified Terran Directorate. The Admiral sends her regards and apologizes for the dramatic entrance. We considered a less theatrical approach, but our advisors felt that the Council might benefit from a demonstration that our transit capability is what we've indicated." "You teleported onto a secured station," Emverith said. "Yes. That's impossible. It's inconvenient," the ambassador said pleasantly. "But not impossible. We've been working on it for about 7 years. Thesivane looked at him for a long moment. "Ambassador," she said, "your admiral mentioned a proposal." "She did. I would like to hear it." "Of course." He reached into his jacket and produced a single data chip, physical, not transmitted physical, which was itself a statement, and placed it on the council table. "Everything is in there, but I can summarize if you prefer." "Please." "We want in," Ambassador Mehta said simply. "We want membership in the Galactic Accord. Full membership. Not associate status, not monitored provisional membership, not the Category 3 holding pattern you've had us in for 40 years. Full membership, with all rights and responsibilities thereof." "Your application was reviewed," Thesivane said carefully. "We determined that humanity did not meet the threshold for—" "We know what you determined," the ambassador said. Not rudely, simply. "We've had 40 years to read the assessment. We disagree with the threshold. We think your categories are designed for a pattern of development that assumes a species progresses slowly, that you have time to monitor and assess and decide, that the thing you're looking at is going to stay more or less the same between the time you first see it and the time you vote on it." A pause. "We are not that thing." "And if we refuse?" Thesivane asked. The ambassador's expression did not change. "Then we will not be members of the Galactic Accord," he said. "And we will continue to exist in the galaxy, in the same galaxy as you, doing what we do, building what we build, going where we decide to go." Another pause. "We are not making a threat, Arbiter Prime. We are making an observation. We think you should be part of our future. We think you might find it interesting. We are asking, politely for the last time, whether you would like to join us, or whether you would prefer to watch. The vote should have taken days. By accord procedure, a full membership application required a minimum of 72 hours of open debate, a formal review period, a written assessment from the Xenosociological Committee, a security evaluation, and 3 separate readings of the formal resolution before any vote could be called. That was for normal applications. There had never been an abnormal one. Ambassador Mehta sat quietly in a chair at the edge of the chamber, while 47 species held the most chaotic deliberation in Accord history. He had declined refreshments and declined company, and spent most of the time reading something on a small device he had produced from his jacket. When Thesavane's aide quietly tried to see what he was reading, the ambassador had smiled and tilted the screen. It was poetry, human poetry, old by human standards, a collection of works from a period they called the 20th century. He did not seem anxious. That, Thesavane thought, was perhaps the most frightening thing about him. The arguments had a different character now than they had before he arrived. Before, the debate had been about threat. What does this mean for our security? How do we protect ourselves? What are they capable of? Now, impossible to ignore the physical presence of a human being who had appeared in the middle of their secured station without triggering a single alarm, who had placed a physical data chip on their table with the casual confidence of someone who was accustomed to being in rooms and being listened to, who was currently reading poetry. The debate shifted. Because the threat calculus had changed. The question was no longer whether humanity was dangerous. The question was whether humanity was more dangerous inside the Accord or outside it. Emverith of the Dreth, who had spent 4 hours demanding Article 17, said something that surprised everyone, including himself. We built this Accord to prevent exactly this situation. A powerful species operating outside the framework of galactic governance, with no treaty obligations, no accountability structures, no agreed-upon rules of conduct. We built it because species like that are how you get wars that end civilizations. He paused. The question is not whether we want humanity in the Accord. The question is whether we want to be the kind of civilization that looks at something we don't understand and tries to destroy it, or the kind that tries to understand it first. A very long silence. That is, said the representative of the Yathrani slowly and somewhat painfully, not incorrect. The data chip contained a full briefing. The Accord's analysts had cracked the encryption within 20 minutes, which was itself a message, Thesavane suspected, because the chip was human technology, and if they could crack human encryption in 20 minutes, it meant either that they were much better than humans at cryptography, or that the humans had let them crack it. She suspected the latter. The briefing inside was comprehensive, clearly structured, and designed. She could tell this from its presentation. To be read by beings who were deciding whether to be afraid of humanity or to work with them. It included specifications for the ship. Its actual name, she learned, was the persistent question, a human phrase that apparently meant something both philosophical and practical. A question that keeps being asked until it is answered. The persistent question was not a warship, though it was armed. It was, the briefing used a human term that the translator rendered awkwardly, a demonstration vessel, a proof of concept. The thing humanity had built to show the galaxy what humanity could do. There were 17 more under construction, of similar size, with improvements. The briefing also included something unexpected, an honest account of humanity's history, not a curated version, not a best-foot-forward diplomatic presentation, a complete account, including the wars, the genocides, the environmental devastation, the centuries of cruelty and short-sightedness and failure. Beside each dark passage there was a note, not an excuse, not an apology, but a specific reference description of what humanity had done to address, understand, or prevent that category of failure in the future. It was not a document that said, "We are good." It was a document that said, "We know what we are and we are working on it and we would like to keep working on it alongside you if you'll have us." Thesavane read that document for 2 hours. Then she called the vote. The procedure under emergency session rules was simple. Each delegation cast a vote, yea or nay, in the order of their Accord seniority. 47 votes. 24 needed for a simple majority, 32 for a supermajority that would grant full, rather than provisional membership. The first 12 votes were yay. The 13th vote, from a delegation that had spent the entire session in visible distress, was a nay. The 14th was yay. By the time the vote reached Thesivane, who as arbiter prime voted last, the count was 43 ye and 3 nay. She looked at Ambassador Mehta, who had put away his poetry at the calling of the vote and was sitting with his hands folded in his lap, watching. She looked at the data chip, still sitting on the table. She looked at the ceiling, the ancient ceiling of carved star bone, and thought about 3,000 years of history, about the wars this room had ended, and the plagues it had halted, and the species it had welcomed, about the 47 civilizations that had looked at a universe that could easily have swallowed them whole, and decided to face it together instead. She thought about a species that had unified in response to finding them, that had built a ship to show them what they were capable of, that had sent a single ambassador into their most secured chamber to ask, one more time, to be treated as equals. She thought about Senior Monitor Vel Adric's last report. I think we made a terrible mistake. Not a warning, she thought, a recognition. Yay, she said. The Galactic Accord did not dissolve that day, but it was never the same. The 3 delegations that had voted nay submitted formal protests and then, over the following weeks, quietly withdrew them. Because the thing about being in a room with Ambassador Mehta, Thesivane later told her staff, was that you left the room having understood something you had not understood when you entered it. Humanity had not come to conquer. Humanity had not come to demand. Humanity had come to negotiate. From a position of strength, it had spent a decade building in secret, and it had brought poetry. That meant something. She was not sure what exactly, but it meant something. 3 days after the vote, Admiral Yara Osei brought the persistent question to dock at the Hall of Convergence Station. It did not fit in the docking bay, obviously, so it simply held position outside, visible through every viewport on the station, enormous and dark and pulsing with its slow heartbeat light, while its crew, 3,000 humans, came aboard in shuttle after shuttle for what the Accord's protocol department was hastily labeling a historic first contact formalization ceremony. The humans brought food. They brought music. They brought apparently an inexhaustible capacity for ceremony and celebration that the Accord's xenopsychologists had not anticipated, and that turned out to be deeply, unexpectedly moving. They also brought, at Admiral Osei's personal insistence, the complete archives of Earth's history. Every war, every art movement, every scientific breakthrough, every failure and recovery, encoded on a crystal that she placed in Thesivane's hands, with the directness Thesivane was learning was simply how humans communicated when they meant something seriously. So you understand us, Osei said. We don't need you to approve of everything in there. We just need you to know. Thesivane held the crystal and felt the weight of it, the weight of a species' entire recorded memory, offered without reservation, and thought about the 44 years since humanity's first application, and the 40 years since it had been shelved, and the 11 years of unity and construction and quiet preparation, and the 6 hours of an ultimatum that was not quite an ultimatum, and the vote that had taken 2 hours instead of 72. We know, she said. Outside the viewports, the persistent question held steady in the dark between stars, patient now that patience had reached its limit, vast and new and waiting to see what came next. Inside the Hall of Convergence, 47 species and 1 new member were beginning to understand what it meant to share a galaxy, with something that did not know how to stay in the categories you built for it. It was, Thesivane thought, going to be extraordinary. It was going to be terrifying. It was going to be exactly what 3,000 years of galactic cooperation had been working toward without knowing it. She was 900 years old. She had never been so glad that she had more time. It began with a ring, not a sound, not a signal. A physical ring. 2,000 warships arranged in a perfect sphere around the entire solar system, 300 million kilometers from the sun, positioned with such geometric precision that the distance between each vessel was identical to within 3 meters. A ring of fire and metal and absolute authority, stretching from inside Mercury's orbit to beyond the Kuiper Belt. A cage built around an entire civilization. The Galactic Compact called it a containment measure. Everyone else called it what it was: a blockade. It had never been done before, not at this scale. Smaller blockades had been used against individual colony worlds, single stations, wayward freighters. But enclosing an entire home system, an entire species, inside a military cordon that spanned hundreds of millions of kilometers, that was new. That was deliberate. That was the Galactic Compact sending a message not just to humanity, but to every species watching from the safe distance of their own star systems. This is what we can do, remember that. The stated reason was the Santiago incident, a human deep exploration vessel that had, 7 months earlier, crossed into a region of space the Compact had designated a protected observation zone without authorization. The crew had not known. The designation had been made 14 days before their crossing, communicated through diplomatic channels that humanity's Compact liaison had not yet processed. A clerical failure. A genuine, documented, provable clerical failure, for which the human government had formally apologized 4 times. The Compact had accepted the apology, and then blockaded the solar system anyway, because the Santiago incident was not the reason. The reason, the real reason, understood by every diplomat and military analyst and back-channel negotiator in the galaxy, was the Battle of the Kepler Zone, 8 months earlier. The battle that had never been supposed to happen, in which humanity had dismantled a Velthari pacification fleet with a precision and ferocity that had rewritten every galactic assessment of human military capability, and more dangerously, given other species ideas. The blockade was not punishment for a navigation error. The blockade was a message. We cannot erase what happened, but we can remind you, and everyone watching, who holds the walls. Rear Admiral Cassiel Morrow learned about the blockade the way most people learned about it, not through official channels, but through the sudden, complete absence of outgoing ships. She was commanding the supply convoy Meridian Run, 14 freighters carrying medical equipment, seed stock, and construction materials bound for the outer colonies, when every fold drive in the convoy simultaneously received an override lockout code she had never seen before. Emergency stop all drives. Authorization Galactic Compact Enforcement Division. She stood on the bridge of the convoy escort CSS Arrowhead and stared at the code for a long moment. Then she pulled up the long-range sensor array and looked outward, past Neptune, past the Kuiper Belt, into the deep dark where the numbers said 2,000 ships were sitting. She was a small woman, Cassiel Morrow, compact in build with a face that looked younger than her 47 years and eyes that looked considerably older. She had been born on a station in the asteroid belt. She had never in her life lived on a planet. She had a sister on Ganymede, a brother on the colony world of Proxima Station, and a convoy that was now sitting dead in space because someone had decided that 14 freighters carrying medical equipment were a threat to galactic order. She turned to her communications officer. "Get me UEDC command." "The blockade is—" He stopped, started again. "Admiral, the blockade is jamming long-range communications. We're receiving compact frequencies only." "Then get me the nearest relay buoy." "Jammed." "Short-range ship-to-ship?" "Still operational, within the system only." She absorbed this. "So we can talk to each other. We just can't talk to anyone outside." "Yes, ma'am." She turned back to the sensor display. 2,000 ships. A perfect sphere. Beyond it, the outer colonies, 14 of them, that had been receiving supply convoys on a 17-day rotation cycle. Medical equipment, food supplements, atmospheric processors for the new settlements. Things that people needed, things that had a clock on them. She pulled up the supply inventory for each colony. She ran the numbers. She did it twice because the first time she thought she had made an error. She hadn't. At current consumption rates, with no resupply, Proxima Station, her brother's station, had 91 days of food reserves. The 3 youngest colonies, still in early terraforming phases and heavily dependent on supply lines, had less. 40 days. Maybe 50 if they rationed hard. The compact's containment measure had no stated end date. Morrow closed the inventory screen and was quiet for a very long time. Then she opened a new file and started writing. Not a report, not a formal complaint, not a diplomatic request, a plan. 3 days into the blockade, the compact's senior enforcement commander transmitted a message to UEDC headquarters. Admiral Throne Vath, a Kilvari, a species whose physical form resembled something between an architectural column and a weather system, spoke in measured, almost courteous tones. He expressed confidence that the containment period would be brief. He outlined the conditions for its lifting, a comprehensive review of human navigation protocols, submission of all exploration vessel flight plans for prior compact approval, and, buried in paragraph 11 of a 17-paragraph document, a formal acknowledgement that the Battle of the Kepler Zone had constituted an unauthorized military action, for which humanity accepted full compact jurisdiction. That last condition was the actual point. If humanity signed it, they were not just acknowledging a navigation error. They were retroactively criminalizing their own self-defense. They were telling every species in the galaxy that the compact had the right to dictate when a civilization was and was not allowed to protect itself. Secretary General Diallo read the document 3 times. Then she called her senior legal counsel, her military advisors, and Admiral Park, who was 3 systems away, and whose voice on the secure channel carried the particular flatness of someone measuring their words very carefully. "They're not going to lift it," Park said. "Not in 40 days, maybe not in 400. The 3rd condition is designed to be unacceptable. They want us to either sign it, which breaks us politically, or refuse it, which lets them keep the blockade running indefinitely while claiming we're the obstacle to resolution." "And the colonies?" Diallo asked. A pause. 40 days. Another pause. "Cassiel Morrow filed a report," Park said. "You should read it." Diallo pulled it up while he was still on the line. She read it once fast, then again slowly. Then she was quiet for a moment. "This is insane," she said. It was not a criticism, it was an assessment. "Yes," Park said. "It might also be the only thing that works." No blockade in galactic history had ever been broken. This was not merely a statistic. It was a foundational assumption of compact military doctrine, the reason that blockades had become the preferred tool of coercion against species that were too visible to simply attack and too inconvenient to ignore. The logic was geometric and total. Enough ships positioned correctly covered every possible exit vector. Fold drives required a minimum charge time of 11 minutes, during which the vessel's location was precisely detectable. Any ship attempting a fold jump from inside a blockade sphere was simply a target that helpfully announced its own coordinates 11 minutes in advance. The doctrine had held for 2 centuries. No one had broken it because no one had found a way around the 11-minute problem. Morrow's plan was based on the premise that the 11-minute problem was not, in fact, the actual problem. She had written 47 pages. Her communications officer, Lieutenant Priya Danesh, had read all 47 pages in one sitting and then spent 20 minutes completely silent before saying, "You know this is either the most brilliant thing I've ever read or it's going to get us all killed." "Probably both," Morrow had said. The plan had 3 fundamental insights, each one building on the last. The first insight was about what a blockade actually guarded against. Compact blockade doctrine was designed to prevent organized military breakouts, large ships, military-grade fold drives, coordinated jumps. The 2,000 vessels were positioned and armed to intercept exactly that. Anything big, anything fast, anything that looked like a threat. What the doctrine was not specifically designed for, because no one had ever needed to specifically design against it, was the complete opposite. Slow, small, invisible. Not invisible in the stealth technology sense. Invisible in the sense of not registering as a meaningful threat. Invisible in the way that background noise is invisible to a sensor calibrated to detect signals. The second insight was about the construction capacity that humanity had been quietly developing in the asteroid belt for 30 years. Not military construction, industrial. The kind of unglamorous, massive-scale infrastructure building that no compact intelligence assessment had bothered to deeply analyze because it wasn't weapons, it wasn't ships, it wasn't interesting. Morrow had a complete inventory. She had requested it the night she wrote the plan, citing supply logistics as justification, which was technically true. What the inventory showed was something that made her sit very still for a while. Humanity had, in the asteroid belt, the capacity to build a lot of things very quickly. The third insight was the strangest one, and the one that had kept Dinesh silent for 20 minutes. It was about how blockade enforcement worked at the operational level, specifically about what 2,000 ships crewing 600 people each were actually doing moment to moment during a containment operation that was intended to last months. They were watching, monitoring, running sensor sweeps, processing an enormous quantity of data about a solar system that contained, nominally, the entire human civilian and military apparatus. They were looking at a lot, which meant they were filtering a lot, which meant there was a threshold, a noise floor, below which a signal was processed as irrelevant and dismissed. Morrow had done some calculations about what that noise floor was. She had then done some calculations about what humanity could do that stayed below it. When she briefed Admiral Park, she used a phrase that he later said he had been thinking about for weeks, without quite being able to articulate. "The blockade is a wall," she said. "We're not going to go through it, we're not going to go over it, we're going to go under it, and we're going to do it in a way that they won't realize is happening until it's already done." Park had been quiet for a moment. "How many ships?" "Not ships," Morrow said. "Pods." The fabrication order went out through short-range relay, the only communication channel still open within the blockaded system. It was disguised, at Morrow's insistence, as a routine asteroid mining equipment requisition. This was not difficult to disguise because it was technically what it was. The fabrication plants in the belt were already producing extraction pods, small, automated, unpiloted units designed to be fired at asteroid surfaces, latch on, drill, collect, and return. They were manufactured by the thousands. They were boring. They were part of the background noise of a civilization going about its industrial business, which was exactly what the Compact's sensor teams were processing them as. What changed was their interior configuration. In their standard form, extraction pods carried drilling equipment and collection containers. The modified form, specifications transmitted in 3 separate pieces through 3 separate supply logistics channels, assembled by the fabrication AI without any single channel having the complete picture, carried something different. The drilling equipment was replaced with a compressed cargo section, sealed and thermally stabilized. The collection container was replaced with a navigation package, not a full drive, nothing that required an 11-minute charge-up, nothing that registered as a jump signature, a conventional thruster array, very small, very slow, designed to operate at low enough power output that its thermal signature was indistinguishable from background solar radiation at any distance beyond 400 kilometers. Each pod could carry approximately 300 kilograms of sealed cargo. Each pod, once it cleared the inner system under the cover of normal mining operations, would take approximately 11 days to reach the blockade perimeter at minimal signature thrust. 11 days. Moving slowly, quietly as part of a background that 2,000 warships were already in the habit of ignoring. Not jumping, not announcing, just moving. The way that objects in space had always moved before fold drives existed. The way that nobody moved anymore because it was too slow to matter, unless you were planning ahead. Unless you had thought about it quietly in the back of your mind for 30 years. Unless you had built an industrial infrastructure in the asteroid belt that could produce 10,000 small objects per week, and unless those objects were already so ubiquitous in the sensor data of every ship watching you that they registered as noise. The first batch of pods was authorized and began fabrication 6 days into the blockade. By day 10, the first wave of 3,000 was processing through normal mining dispatch channels, logged, cataloged, moving outward through the system on vectors that the Compact's Enforcement Division reviewed and dismissed in automated batch processing. The cargo in those pods: medical supplies, concentrated nutrition packs, atmospheric processor components, seeds, water purification elements, Everything the colonies needed. Nothing that looked like a weapon. Nothing that looked like a breakout attempt. Just supplies, moving very slowly through space in very small containers, below the threshold of what a blockade designed to stop warships was calibrated to consider meaningful. On the compact flagship Unyielding Authority, Admiral Throne Voth received his daily operational briefing at precisely the scheduled hour. Sensor sweeps, nominal. Human military movements, none. Communication traffic within the system, reduced, consistent with a population under communication lockdown. Fold drive activation signatures, 0. His intelligence officer mentioned, briefly, an uptick in asteroid belt extraction pod deployment. Standard industrial activity, automated systems, fully consistent with normal human mining operations. It had been reviewed. Nothing of concern. Throne Voth acknowledged the briefing and moved on. In the outer system, 3,000 small objects moved through the dark. Rear Admiral Morrow spent the 11 days doing what she had always done best. Logistics. Not the glamorous kind. Not the kind that appeared in military histories. The kind that required sitting in front of a spreadsheet at 0200 hours and working out whether pod batch 17 had the correct nutrient density to cover the caloric shortfall in Proxima Station's rationing protocol, while also accounting for the 3% spoilage rate in the atmospheric processor components if transit temperature dropped below -40. She slept 4 hours a night. Danesh, who had become effectively her chief of staff, slept slightly less. The convoy crews, 14 ships sitting useless in the inner system, their fold drives locked, had been repurposed into a logistics coordination cell, each ship's crew assigned to specific colonies, specific supply calculations, specific pod batch manifests. They were very good at it. Freighter crews were always good at logistics. That was the job. On day 4, she received a transmission from her brother on Proxima Station. It was short. He knew she would be busy. He said, "I don't know what's happening out there, but I know you. Whatever you're doing, be careful." She flagged the message. She would answer it later. She went back to the spreadsheet. On day 6, the first signs of stress appeared in the outer colonies. Proxima Station's governor, a woman named Lena Osei, who had been running the station for 12 years and had, in Morrow's assessment, the operational toughness of someone who had spent a decade keeping 4,000 people alive in deep space, transmitted a status report that was factual, calm, and contained exactly one sentence that Morrow read 3 times. "We have begun implementing emergency rationing protocols as of today. Morale is holding. We know someone is working on it." Morrow read that last sentence. She did not let herself feel anything about it until she was alone, and then she allowed herself approximately 90 seconds of a feeling she couldn't quite name, something between the weight of responsibility and the thing that sits underneath it when you know you are carrying it for people who trust you. And then she set it aside and went back to work. On day 8, a problem emerged. One of the compact's outer patrol groups, 12 frigates stationed near the Kuiper Belt perimeter, closer to the exit vectors, had modified their sensor sweep pattern. Not significantly. A 3-degree rotation in their coverage arc, likely a standard procedure adjustment. But the rotation created a narrow overlap zone where the resolution of 2 ships' sensor packages combined in a way that slightly exceeded the background noise threshold that Morrow had calculated. Pod Batch 11, which was already 40% of the way to the perimeter, was transiting through that zone. Danesh flagged it at 0340 hours. Morrow was asleep. Danesh woke her anyway. They had 40 minutes before Batch 11 entered the overlap zone. Morrow looked at the problem for 30 seconds. Reroute the batch, 2-degree yaw adjustment, reduce thrust to 60%. It'll extend their transit time by 19 hours. That pushes Proxima Station's supply arrival past. I know. Recalculate the rationing protocol. We find 19 hours somewhere. She was already pulling up the spreadsheet. What else? Batch 19 is still on schedule. No issues. Batch 19 carries the atmospheric processors. Yes, ma'am. Good. She was quiet for a moment, working through the numbers. Get me the governor of New Perth Colony. I need to know their exact current reserves, not the filed estimate. Exact. Danesh looked at her. It's 400. I know. I'll get her. The problem with Batch 11 was resolved. The 19-hour delay was absorbed through a rationing adjustment that Morrow worked out with Governor Osei's logistics team over the following 2 hours. It was not comfortable math. It required asking people who were already rationing to ration slightly harder. Osei agreed without complaint, and with the particular economy of words that Morrow had come to understand as the signature of someone who had long ago made peace with hard choices. On day 9, Morrow received a transmission from UEDC Command through the encrypted short-range relay network. A message bounced from ship to ship across the inner system in segments, reassembled at the endpoint, time delayed but intact. It was from Secretary General Diallo. It read, "We are aware of what you're doing. We have not officially sanctioned it. We will not officially deny it. Do what needs doing." A.D. Morrow read it once, nodded, and filed it. On day 10, Pod Batch 1 reached the outer edge of the blockade sphere. This was the part of the plan that had no historical precedent. Not because no one had ever thought of it. Somewhere, at some point, someone had probably run the theoretical math on low-signature transit as a blockade evasion technique. But because it had never been operationally feasible. You needed thousands of small units which required massive fabrication capacity. You needed 11 days of transit time without detection, which required the background noise camouflage of a long-established industrial operation. You needed precise navigation packages in unpiloted pods, which required an automation technology base that had only reached operational reliability in the last decade. You needed, in other words, exactly the combination of industrial, navigational, and logistical development that humanity had quietly assembled over 30 years while the galaxy watched its military capacity and assumed that was all that mattered. The pods didn't stop at the blockade perimeter. They didn't need to. There was no physical barrier, just ships and sensors, and the assumption that anything worth stopping would announce itself. Batch 1 passed through the gaps between compact warships at distances ranging from 900 to 4,000 kilometers, moving slowly, quietly, their thermal signatures folded into the vast background of solar radiation and cosmic noise. Not one of them was detected. At the compact flagship, the automated sensor processing system logged 17,000 discrete objects in the Kuiper Belt transit zone that day. It flagged 0 of them as anomalous. The batch processing algorithm that reviewed objects under 2 meters in diameter, moving below 15 meters per second, with thermal signatures within 2 standard deviations of ambient, which described every single one of Morrow's pods perfectly, dismissed them without human review. 3,000 supplies pods crossed the most powerful blockade in galactic history. They didn't break it. They ignored it. And 2 days later, the first of them arrived at Proxima Station. Governor Osei was in the station's operations center when the proximity alert sounded. Not the emergency klaxon, the soft chime of an inbound object. Non-threatening. Small. Something the automated system had flagged for human review because it was on an approach vector but too small to be a ship. Her operations officer pulled up the sensor data, looked at it again. Governor, it's an asteroid extraction pod. From where? From the inner system. It's been traveling for, he checked the trajectory calculation, 11 days. Osei looked at the screen, at the small, unassuming object approaching her station, at the thermal signature that matched a standard extraction pod perfectly, at the navigation package that had guided it, alone, across 4 billion kilometers of empty space, without a single course correction error. "Open it," she said. The pod's cargo seal released. Inside, medical supplies, concentrated nutrition, atmospheric processor components, wrapped carefully, sealed against temperature variance, enough to cover 2 weeks of the station's current shortfall. 1 pod. There were 3,000 more inbound. Osei stood at the operations window and looked out at the stars for a long moment. Her operations officer was quiet beside her, because he was smart enough to know when someone needed a moment. When she turned back, her eyes were dry. Her expression was entirely composed. Her voice was steady. "Get me a receiving schedule," she said. "I want every pod cataloged and distributed within 6 hours of arrival, And someone get me a line to Rear Admiral Morrow. Communication lockdown. We'll bounce it. Find a way. The way was found. The transmission took 9 hours to reach Morrow through the relay network, arriving in fragments, reassembled by the Arrowhead's communication system at 0200 hours on day 14 of the blockade. It said, "Supplies received, station secure. Whatever you did, it worked. Tell me how." Morrow read it. She was sitting at her desk, the spreadsheet still open, the next 12 batches already in progress. The data in front of her said that at current production rate, she could sustain the supply schedule indefinitely. Not comfortably, not without difficulty, but sustainably. The colonies would not starve. The atmospheric processors would not fail. The people on Proxima Station and New Perth and the 11 other outer settlements would have what they needed. The blockade was still there. 2,000 ships, perfect sphere, 300 million kilometers in every direction. It had not moved. It had not been defeated. No military force had challenged it. It had simply been made irrelevant. It was not Morrow who told the galaxy. It was the Compact. On day 22 of the blockade, a routine intelligence review on the unyielding authority flagged an anomaly. Not in sensor data, the pods were still passing through undetected, but in a commercial shipping manifest from Proxima Station that had been transmitted on a Compact-monitored short-range frequency. The manifest listed incoming cargo received over the previous 8 days. The cargo types were consistent with resupply. The origin code on the manifest referenced inter-system fabrication facilities. The intelligence officer who reviewed it sat with it for an hour before escalating. He was not a slow thinker. He was a thorough one. He wanted to make sure he understood what he was looking at before he told his admiral that the blockade that had never in galactic history been broken might currently be, not broken exactly, circumvented, in the most undramatic possible fashion, by small automated containers that his sensors had been processing as asteroid mining equipment. Admiral Thronevath did not take the news well. He took it quietly. That was in many ways worse, the silence of a very powerful entity re-evaluating a situation it had been completely confident about. He reviewed the data himself. He ordered a full sensor audit going back to the first day of the blockade. What the audit revealed was not comfortable viewing. Thousands of pods crossing the perimeter daily, moving through the most heavily defended cordon in the galaxy, on momentum and patience, and the assumption that his doctrine covered everything worth covering. It hadn't. "How long has this been happening?" he asked. "We believe since day 11, sir. The first batches would have begun transit on 11 days. His voice was very controlled. "They began this on day 4. The fabrication orders were placed on day 4. He turned from the display. They read the blockade parameters, identified the sensor threshold, and designed a response within 4 days. His intelligence officer did not respond, because there was nothing to add. Thronevath stood at his window for a long time. Outside it, his fleet hung in its perfect sphere. 2,000 warships, the most powerful blockade ever assembled. And somewhere in the dark between them, hundreds of small containers moved in patient silence, carrying exactly the cargo they needed to carry to the places they needed to carry it, right through the middle of everything he had built. "They're not trying to break the blockade," he said slowly. "They're demonstrating that it doesn't matter." No one replied. "If we increase sensor resolution to cover low-signature objects, it would require retasking 60% of the fleet's processing capacity, sir. And the pods are small enough that at distances below 200 kilometers, we would still face significant false positive." "They designed them that way," Thronevath said. It was not a question. "Almost certainly, yes." He was quiet for a long time. "They want us to know," he said finally. "They want us to find out and understand that we cannot stop it without fundamentally breaking our ability to function as a blockade fleet. This was not just a supply operation. It was a demonstration." He was right. And he knew, with the cold clarity of someone who had just been outthought by a species he had been certain he outclassed, that there was a second problem growing underneath the operational one, because the Compact didn't keep secrets well. It was too large, too distributed, too dependent on the cooperative communication networks of 67 member species to maintain tight operational security on something as significant as an ongoing blockade of a major civilization. What Admiral Throne Voth had discovered in his intelligence review would not stay in his intelligence review. It would move through the channels and networks and informal exchanges that connected every species in the galaxy, outward and outward until it reached the places that mattered. It reached them in 11 days, which was, in its own way, fitting. The species that heard it first were the small ones, the Tier 4 and Tier 5 civilizations that the Compact had spent decades blockading, coercing, and economically strangling in ways that were technically legal and practically indistinguishable from slow violence. The species that had always calculated the math and found that resistance was impossible, that the Compact's walls were absolute, that the choices available to them were compliance or irrelevance. They heard about Morrow's pods. They heard about asteroid extraction equipment repurposed into supply containers, about 11-day transits below sensor thresholds, about a rear admiral who had sat in the middle of the most powerful blockade ever assembled and spent 4 days figuring out its noise floor. And what they heard was not just a logistics story. What they heard was, the walls are not absolute. The diplomatic consequences arrived before the military ones. 3 Compact member species, not the powerful core members but the middle-tier civilizations that had long held quiet resentments about the Compact's enforcement practices, filed formal procedural objections to the continued blockade within 48 hours of the story becoming widely known. The objections were legal in nature, citing Compact charter provisions on proportional response. By themselves, they would have been manageable. But they came with something attached, the detailed technical specifications of Morrow's pod system, filed as a legal exhibit, illustrating that the blockade's humanitarian impact had been overstated because a workaround existed. The specifications were now in the public Compact legal record, available to anyone. Secretary General Diallo watched this unfold from Earth with the focused attention of someone who had spent 11 years learning how the Compact's internal politics actually worked, rather than how they were supposed to work. She had 3 senior legal counselors working around the clock. She had 4 diplomatic communications running simultaneously with Compact member species whose support she had been quietly building for years. She had, it turned out, been building the long game at the same time that Morrow had been running the short one. When the Compact's internal council convened an emergency review of the blockade on day 26, she was ready. She didn't go in asking for the blockade to be lifted. She went in presenting evidence. Evidence that the blockade had failed its stated humanitarian threshold, because the colonies it had been designed to pressure had not been deprived of supplies. Evidence that the blockade had failed its legal proportionality test, because 3 independent legal filings by member species had raised the question formally, and the Council was required to address it. Evidence, most devastatingly, that the intelligence failure involved in not detecting the pod operation for 11 days raised serious questions about whether the Enforcement Division was fit to be running a containment measure of this scale. She did not say you failed. She said the mechanism failed. She did not attack the Compact. She attacked the specific operation. The distinction was careful and precise and legally significant, and it drove a wedge exactly where she had measured the gap. 3 hours into the council session, the Velthari bloc, already weakened by the fallout from Kepler, declined to vote in favor of continued blockade. 2 swing vote species abstained, which under Compact voting rules had the same effect as a no. The resolution to continue the blockade failed by 2 votes. On the unyielding authority, Admiral Throne Voth received the Council's decision at 1600 hours. He spent 4 minutes reviewing it. Then, he issued the stand-down order to his fleet, 2,000 warships, slowly changing their perfect geometry, beginning the long process of dispersal back to their home bases. The ring around the solar system dissolved. It did not dissolve because it was defeated in battle. It dissolved because a woman sitting in a stationary convoy escort ship had spent 4 days doing math. Morrow heard about the blockade's dissolution through the relay network, the same way she had been receiving all news for 26 days. Fragmented, time-delayed, reassembled. The message was from Dinesh, who had excellent situational awareness and a gift for brevity. It said, "It's down. You did it." Morrow read it. She was at her desk. She had been at her desk for most of the last 26 days. The spreadsheet was still open. She saved it, closed it, and sat for a moment in the quiet of her cabin. Outside the Arrowhead's hull, the solar system, unblockaded, the familiar stars in their familiar positions, the outer planets going about their ancient business as if 2,000 warships had never surrounded them. She thought about the 11 days, the sensor noise floor calculations, the modified pods moving through 4 billion kilometers of dark space, the governor of Proxima Station at her operations window, looking at a small container that had crossed a galactic blockade on conventional thrusters and patience. She thought about her brother. She had never answered his message. She opened the comm system and started typing. It was short. She was tired, and she had a lot of work still to do. The supply schedule needed to be transitioned back to normal convoy operations. The fabrication orders wound down. The convoy fold drive lockouts formally cleared through UEDC logistics. Her message said, "Sorry I didn't write back. I was busy. Everything's fine. Tell me when you're free for dinner." She sent it. She pulled up the next task file. She started working. In the days after the blockade dissolved, the galaxy processed what had happened in the particular way that major paradigm shifts were always processed. Slowly at first, then all at once, with a great deal of argument about what it actually meant. Military analysts focused on the operational aspects, the sensor threshold calculation, the use of industrial infrastructure as a strategic asset, the use of transit time as a feature rather than a limitation. 3 separate compact member species filed classified requests for the full technical specifications within a week of the pod system's details becoming public record, which was either concerning or, depending on your perspective, encouraging. It meant that other civilizations were thinking about what they could do with the same approach. Diplomatic analysts focused on Diallo's council strategy, the surgical use of legal mechanism and coalition building that had turned an intelligence failure into a political defeat for the enforcement bloc. Seminars on it were being proposed at 3 compact member academies within a month. But what spread furthest, across news relays, through informal communication networks, in the conversations of species who had spent decades telling themselves that the compact's walls were absolute, was simpler than the operational analysis or the legal strategy. It was the image of 3,000 extraction pods. Ordinary. Industrial. Boring. Moving slowly through space. Too small to matter, too common to notice, too patient to stop. Getting through anyway. Not by being stronger than the wall. Not by being faster than the wall. By being something the wall hadn't been built to see. On Proxima Station, Governor Osei posted an official account of the supply operation to the station's public record. It was factual and detailed and deliberately unsexy. It described pod dimensions and transit times and cargo manifests and rationing protocols. It read in large stretches like exactly what it was, a logistics report. At the bottom, she had added one line that was not part of the operational record. This station was never in danger of being forgotten. Someone was always working on it, that's worth knowing. On the Arrowhead, Lieutenant Dinesh watched the outer solar system through the observation port as the convoy fold drives received their clearance codes and came back online, one by one, filling the bridge with the familiar hum of drives warming up and a journey resuming. Morrow came onto the bridge as the last clearance came through. She looked at the drive's display, all green, all charged, ready. "Course for the outer colonies," she said. "Standard convoy formation. Full manifest." "Aye, ma'am." Dinesh looked at her. "You know they're going to want to debrief you for weeks." "I know, and there will probably be hearings and reports, and someone will want to name something after you." "Nobody is naming anything after me," Morrow said firmly. "A pod, maybe." "Absolutely not. The Morrow pod has a nice... Plot the course, Dinesh." Dinesh plotted the course, smiling at her station. The Arrowhead began to move, the convoy falling into formation behind it. 14 freighters carrying medical equipment and seed stock and construction materials, and everything else that a civilization moving outward into the dark needed to keep moving. The fold drives built toward jump. The solar system fell behind. Ahead, the outer colonies and the people in them and the work of keeping them alive and connected and part of something larger than themselves. The quiet, unglamorous, absolutely essential work that no military history would ever fully describe because it didn't happen on a battlefield. It happened in spreadsheets at Oro 200 hours. In conversations with governors about rationing adjustments. In navigation code compiled for a small automated pod that needed to travel 4 billion kilometers alone and arrive at exactly the right place. The arrowhead folded into jump. Around it, the convoy followed, and out there, somewhere in the vast dark between stars, the last of the extraction pods, the ones from the final batches, still in transit when the blockade lifted, continued on their patient trajectories. They didn't know the blockade was gone. They had no sensors, no receivers, no awareness of what had changed. They simply moved as they had been programmed to move, toward the places they had been sent. They would arrive in 11 days. They would be received, and the people who received them would know, not from a military victory, not from a diplomatic announcement, but from the simple fact of a package arriving, that someone, somewhere, had thought about them carefully enough to make sure they wouldn't be left behind. That was the thing no blockade had ever been built to stop. And no blockade ever would be. The prison ship Vorkai's Mercy drifted in the cold dark between star systems, carrying 112 children. None of them were criminals. None of them had committed any offense under any galactic law, written or unwritten, ancient or new. They had been taken from their homes, their schools, their beds. Taken while their parents screamed and reached and were held back by soldiers wearing the silver and black insignia of the Keth Dominion. They ranged in age from 4 years old to 17. They were human children, and the Dominion had decided they were useful, not as slaves, not yet, as leverage, yet. As Supreme Chancellor Drevan Voketh, third of his name, ruler of 42 systems, commander of 900 warships, had grown tired of humanity's stubbornness at the negotiating table. For 6 years, the Terran Coalition had refused to surrender navigational rights through the Kepler corridor. That stretch of space, just 11 light-years wide, was the most direct route between the Dominion's eastern and western territories. Without it, Keth supply lines stretched an additional 43 days. 43 days meant fuel costs. Fuel costs meant profit margins. Profit margins meant everything to a civilization built on commerce and conquest. Drevan Voketh had offered trade deals. Humanity had declined. He had offered military alliances. Humanity had said they would consider it, which in diplomatic language meant no. He had threatened economic sanctions. Humanity had shrugged, tightened its own belts, and told the Chancellor that the Kepler corridor was sovereign Terran space and would remain so. So Drevan Voketh had tried something different. His intelligence operatives had identified 17 human colony worlds, frontier settlements, thin on military presence, rich in civilians. And on a Tuesday morning by the Terran standard calendar, Keth extraction teams had landed on 6 of those worlds simultaneously. They had not fired a single weapon. There had been no battle. They had simply walked into schools and community centers and playgrounds, announced that the children of these settlements were being taken into protective Dominion custody, and departed. 112 children. The Chancellor's message to the Terran Coalition Council had been simple, elegant, and, in his estimation, utterly unanswerable. Agree to our terms within 30 days, or the children will be processed into Dominion labor integration. They will not be harmed if you cooperate. The choice, as always, belongs to humanity. He had expected panic. He had expected emergency sessions, tearful diplomats, desperate concessions. He had dealt with dozens of species across his 40-year reign, and every single one of them, when their young were threatened, had folded. It was the universal constant of intelligent life. You could threaten armies, economies, entire civilizations, and warriors would stand firm. But threaten the children, and the warriors became parents. Parents made bad decisions. Bad decisions made good deals for Drevan Voketh. He poured himself a glass of Chivaroot wine and waited. He was still waiting when his communications officer came sprinting into the throne chamber. Not walking, not jogging, but sprinting, with a look on his face that Dravan Voketh had never seen on any subordinate in 4 decades of rule. It was not fear, exactly. It was the specific expression of someone who had just looked over a cliff edge and realized the cliff was far, far taller than anyone had measured. "Chancellor," the officer said, his voice barely above a whisper. "The humans have responded." It was 11 words. "You have 72 hours to return them, every single one." Dravan read it twice. Then he laughed, a short, sharp laugh of genuine disbelief. "That's it? No terms? No conditions? No—" "There is an attachment, Chancellor." He opened the attachment. It was a sensor feed. Live, real-time, authenticated by 3 independent relay stations, so there could be no question of fabrication. It showed space, specifically the space along the outer border of Keth Dominion territory. And in that space, moving in complete silence in perfect formation, were ships. Not a patrol fleet, not a battle group. Every human warship in existence. To understand what Dravan Voketh saw on that screen, one must first understand something about humanity that most galactic civilizations had spent 300 years getting wrong. The Keth Dominion had done its research, as it always did before an operation. Their intelligence files on humanity were thorough, 2,000 pages of analysis covering Terran military capability, economic output, political structure, and psychological profile. The psychological profile section was particularly detailed. It had taken 17 analysts 8 months to compile, and had been personally reviewed by the Chancellor himself. The analysts had noted that humans were, compared to most spacefaring species, remarkably aggressive when threatened. They had a long history of internal warfare that had, paradoxically, made them exceptionally good at external warfare. Their military technology was competitive, not superior to the Dominions, but not inferior either. Their soldiers were disciplined, adaptive, and disturbingly creative in combat situations. All of this was accurate. What the analysts had failed to capture, what 17 brilliant minds and 8 months of study had entirely missed, was the emotional architecture of humanity. They had studied humans at war. They had not understood what made humans go to war. There is a phrase, ancient by Terran standards, that predates spaceflight by several thousand years. Do not come between a parent and their child. It appears in various forms, in over 200 distinct human languages and cultures. It predates writing. It predates agriculture. It is carved into the oldest stones humans ever shaped into monuments, scratched into cave walls alongside pictures of hunts and fires, and the stars that humans had always, even before they could reach them, looked up at with hunger. The Keth analysts had classified this as elevated protective instinct, factor 3.2 on the behavioral threat scale. A manageable variable. Something to be leveraged, not feared. They had never bothered to ask, how many warships does a factor 3.2 protective instinct actually produce? The answer, as Dravan Voketh was now discovering, was all of them. The Terran Coalition Navy comprised 407 active warships. This included everything from the massive dreadnoughts of the First Fleet to the sleek fast destroyers assigned to border patrol. Under normal operational doctrine, the Coalition Navy was distributed across Terran space. Some ships on patrol, some in dry dock, some on convoy escort, some in training exercises. At any given moment, less than a quarter of the fleet could be assembled in one place within 30 days. 4 days after the children were taken, all 407 ships were moving toward Keth space. They were not moving at combat speed. They were moving at maximum speed, a distinction that most military minds never needed to make, because the two are not the same. Maximum speed strips away formation discipline, fuel efficiency, tactical spacing. It is the speed of a fleet that is not planning an approach. It is the speed of a fleet that is simply coming, as fast as physics allows, and does not care what it looks like when it arrives. But the ships were only part of what Dravan Voketh was seeing. Behind the warships, And this was the part that made his intelligence chief go very quiet, and remain very quiet for a long time, were the civilian vessels. Modified freighters with weapons welded to their hulls. Mining ships carrying plasma cutters that, at close range, would do exactly what their designers never intended. Transport vessels loaded not with cargo but with human soldiers who had not waited for official mobilization, who had simply shown up at spaceports with weapons and armor, and said in various ways that they were going and someone should give them a ride. And behind those, still more ships, private vessels, pleasure craft, racing yachts, ancient, creaking colony ships that hadn't left orbit in 40 years, shuddering back to life because someone had decided to restart their engines and point them at Keth space. The sensor feed showed 1,143 vessels. For a civilization of 300 colony worlds, spread across 60 light-years, humanity had, in 4 days, assembled the largest fleet ever recorded in this arm of the galaxy. And they were moving at maximum speed. And they were not slowing down. Dravan Voketh sat very still for a long time. Then, quietly, he said to his communications officer, "Get me Admiral Tessavar, and someone bring me a larger screen." The first call came from Ambassador Lyrian of the Vial Consortium, humanity's closest galactic ally, and, more importantly, a civilization that shared a 2,000 light-year border with the Keth Dominion. "Chancellor," Lyrian said, his 4 eyes blinking in rapid sequence, the Vial expression for profound anxiety. "I am calling as a friend. Turn the ships around. Return the children immediately." "The situation is under diplomatic review," Dravan said. "Chancellor, with respect, I have been watching the Terran fleet feed for the past 6 hours. Lyrian paused. "I have also been receiving communications from my border stations. The humans did not simply send warships. They sent everything. Our analysts believe they are operating on a principle we do not have a word for in Vial. The closest translation is," another pause, longer this time. "The closest translation is, until none remain." Dravan frowned. "What does that mean exactly?" "It means they are not sending a force size to retrieve the children, Chancellor. They are sending a force size to ensure that whoever took the children cannot take any children, ever again." The call ended shortly after. Lyrian had other calls to make. Over the next 18 hours, Dravan Voketh received 26 communications from heads of state, military commanders, trade alliance representatives, and neutral observers from across the galactic community. The content varied. The tone did not. The Marathi hegemony, who had fought a 3-year border war against humanity 40 years ago and negotiated an uneasy peace, sent a single line: "We advise the Chancellor to consider the outcome of every conflict in which a human child has been used as leverage. There are no such outcomes on record, because there are no such conflicts on record. No civilization has ever tried this before. There is a reason." The collective of Saren, who were pacifists by both culture and biology, sent a more emotional message. "We are begging you. We have studied human history for 200 years, and we know what they are capable of when they are afraid for their young. They are not angry yet. They are still in the stage before anger. Please, Chancellor, there is still time." What stage was before anger? Dravan sent a query to his xenopsychology team. The answer came back in 40 minutes, and the lead analyst, a Keth academic who had spent 30 years studying alien behavioral patterns, had flagged it with the highest priority alert color. The stage before anger in human psychology, when offspring are threatened, is called resolve. It is characterized by the complete absence of panic, negotiation impulse, or self-preservation instinct. A human in a state of resolve regarding their young is not thinking about outcomes. They are not calculating odds. They are not weighing costs. They have already accepted all possible costs. They are simply executing. Chancellor, I must advise in the strongest possible terms. A human in this state does not stop. The fleet you are seeing is not a threat. It is a statement of intent by a species that has already decided. The question is no longer whether they will arrive. The question is whether the children will be there when they do. Dravan read the report. Then he read it again. Then he made a decision that his admirals would later describe as the fastest strategic reversal in Keth Dominion history. He ordered the Vorkai's Mercy to change course. But the prison ship was deep in Dominion space. 6 days of travel from the border even at full speed. The children could not be returned in 72 hours. It was a physical impossibility. So Dravan Voketh did something he had never done in 40 years of rule. He picked up the communication relay and called the Terran coalition directly. Not his ambassador, not a diplomatic intermediary, not a carefully worded formal channel. He called the direct emergency line, which connected, after 3 seconds of silence, to a room he had never seen before. It was a plain room, gray walls, a long table, and seated at that table were people who did not look like diplomats. They were wearing military uniforms. They had the expressions of people who had not slept in 3 days and did not intend to. At the center of the table sat a woman. She was older, gray-haired, with the kind of stillness that Dravan recognized, after a lifetime of politics, as the stillness of someone who has made all their decisions and is simply waiting for events to catch up. Her name, he would later learn, was Admiral General Sarah Mwangi. She was 67 years old. She had 3 grandchildren. 2 of them were on the Vorkai's Mercy. She looked at Dravan Voketh through the screen, and she did not speak first. She simply waited, with that terrible stillness, for him to say something. "The children will be returned," Dravan said. "I give you my personal assurance. However, the ship carrying them is 6 days from the border. We know where the ship is, Chancellor." Her voice was quiet, conversational. It was somehow much worse than shouting would have been. "We've been tracking it since the first day. We know its speed. We know its course. We know every crew member aboard." A pause. "Then you understand the physical limitation. I understand that you have approximately 49 hours remaining on your 72-hour window." She folded her hands on the table. "I also understand that the Vorkai's Mercy is currently traveling at 62% of its maximum rated speed, which means it could be moving faster." Dravan blinked. "Our prison transport protocols require—" "I don't want to hear about your protocols, Chancellor." Still quiet. Still. "I want to hear that you have ordered that ship to full speed, that you have personally guaranteed the safety and well-being of every child aboard, and that you have arranged a transfer point at the border so that my people can take custody of our children before your deadline expires." A pause. "I will wait while you make those arrangements." He stared at her. In 40 years, no one had spoken to him like this. Not allied kings, not conquered generals, not his own admirals. "You are aware," he said carefully, "that my fleet— Your fleet is inferior to mine in this engagement, Chancellor. You have approximately 900 ships. I have 1,143, and mine are moving at maximum speed, and roughly half of them are being piloted by people who have not slept in 4 days and would not stop if you personally asked them to." She tilted her head, very slightly. "I am not negotiating with you. I am giving you a very short window to do the right thing before I no longer have the ability to stop what is coming. Do you understand the distinction?" He did. He had never understood anything so clearly in his life. "I will give the orders immediately," Dravan Voketh said. "I know you will." Admiral General Mwangi unfolded her hands. "I'll stay on the line while you do." The Vorkai's Mercy reached the border of Keth space with 7 hours to spare. The prison ship's captain, a Keith officer named Sorvin Dahl, who had spent the last 4 days watching the Terran fleet approach on long-range sensors and had filed 3 formal complaints with Dominion High Command about being placed in this situation, brought his vessel to a full stop at the designated transfer coordinates with a precision that spoke of profound personal motivation. Waiting for him were 6 Terran ships. Just 6. Small ones. 2 medical frigates, 2 personnel transports, and 2 escort destroyers. The rest of the fleet was still moving, still coming, a wall of ships that filled every sensor screen on the Vorkai's Mercy, like a closing horizon. Captain Dahl had requested, through official channels, that the approaching fleet be ordered to halt. The response had come back from Terran Command in under a minute. They are aware of the transfer. They are not stopping. You have 7 hours. We suggest you move quickly. The transfer took 4 hours. 112 children came off the Vorkai's Mercy in groups, escorted by Keth crew members who had been briefed, and with extreme emphasis, that they were to be gentle, respectful, and to cause absolutely no further incident of any kind. Medical teams from the Terran frigates met each group at the airlock. The children were frightened and tired and hungry, and some of them were very young, and some of them had been crying for 4 days, and some of them had gone quiet in the particular way that adults who work with traumatized children recognize immediately and find deeply alarming. All 112 were alive. All 112 were unharmed, physically at least. The last child to cross the airlock was a small girl, 4 years old, named Cass, who had been taken from the agricultural colony on Kepler 7. She was carrying a small stuffed animal, a handmade thing, clearly old, clearly beloved, that had somehow survived the abduction intact. The Keth crew member escorting her stopped at the airlock and, in a moment that would later appear in every major news feed across the galactic community, crouched down to her level and said something quietly in his own language. A Terran medic, who had studied Keth as part of her xenolinguistics training, later translated it as, "I am sorry this happened. Go home." Cass looked at him. Then she crossed the airlock. The moment the last child was confirmed aboard the Terran vessels, Admiral General Mwangi's voice came over the open channel, the one that every ship in the fleet, human and Keth alike, was monitoring. "All children confirmed safe," she said. "All Terran vessels hold position." The fleet, 1,143 ships that had been moving at maximum speed for 4 days, stopped. For approximately 3 minutes, nothing happened. Then, slowly, the fleet began to turn. Not all of it, most of it. The warships, the military vessels, the official Terran Coalition Navy. They turned, in formation, and began the long journey home. But the civilian ships, the modified freighters, the mining vessels, the ancient colony ships that had restarted their engines for the first time in decades, they held position a little longer. Held it in a way that was not aggressive, not threatening, simply present. A reminder. A notation in the universe's margin. We were here. We came. Remember that we came. Then they, too, turned. Captain Dahl of the Vorkai's Mercy watched them go on his sensor screen. His hands were shaking. He had been a military officer for 22 years and had never been afraid of anything in his career. He filed a formal request for reassignment to an interior posting the following morning. The galactic community had a word for what had happened. Several words, actually, in several languages, coined in the hours and days after the transfer as commentators and historians and political analysts struggled to describe an event that did not fit neatly into any existing framework. The most used term in Terran Standard was simply the response. Clean, simple, accurate. What followed the response was more complicated. Dravan Voketh, in the 48 hours after the children's return, faced the worst political crisis of his 4-decade reign. Not from the Terran Coalition, they had, true to their word, recalled the fleet. They sent no demands, issued no ultimatums, claimed no victory. Admiral General Mwangi gave a single press statement, 9 words long. "Our children are home. We have nothing further to say." The pressure on Dravan came from within, his own admirals, his own cabinet, his own High Senate, the 120-member body that had rubber-stamped his decisions for 30 years without complaint, and was now suddenly finding its voice. "You nearly destroyed us," said Fleet Admiral Vorak at the emergency session. "Not in battle, there was no battle. You nearly destroyed us because you genuinely did not understand what you were doing. I was applying leverage. You applied leverage to the one species in this galaxy that does not respond to leverage the way anything else does." Vorak's composure cracked, the first time Dravan had ever seen it crack. "I have read the battle records, Chancellor. I have studied every conflict humanity has fought since they reached the stars, every single one, and I want you to tell me, in any of those records, in any of the data our intelligence services have collected over 300 years, is there a single instance, one, where a threat against a human child resulted in anything other than complete and total escalation? Silence. There is not, Vorak said quietly, because it has never been tried before. No one was stupid enough to try it before. The political fallout consumed the next 3 months. Dravan Voketh retained his chancellorship, just barely, but surrendered the Kepler corridor negotiation entirely. Terran navigational sovereignty was formally acknowledged. The Keth Dominion paid reparations. The intelligence officials who had designed the extraction operation were reassigned. Quietly, without ceremony, the 2,000-page psychological profile of humanity was recalled, classified, and sent to a team of analysts with a single instruction. Start over. Get it right this time. The new profile, when it was finally completed, 14 months later, was considerably shorter. The key finding took up less than a single page. The lead analyst, a Keth academic named Severith, who had spent those 14 months doing almost nothing but studying human history and culture and biology, had chosen to write it not as a clinical assessment but as a warning, formatted in the emergency alert style used for natural disasters and weapons of mass destruction. It read, "Humans are not unique in loving their children. Nearly every sapient species we have studied has some form of parental protective instinct. What makes humans different is not the presence of this instinct, but its absolute, unconditional, non-negotiable nature. Human protective instinct toward offspring does not include a cost-benefit calculation. When a human child is in danger, the human parent, and by extension, the human community, and by further extension, the entire human civilization, does not ask, can we win? They do not ask, what will this cost us? They do not ask, is this wise? They ask only, how quickly can we get there? This is not a vulnerability to be exploited. We must be absolutely clear on this point. This is not a vulnerability to be exploited. Every previous attempt, in their own history, across centuries of internal and external conflict, to use human children as leverage has ended the same way. Not with negotiation, not with surrender, with the complete removal of the entity that made the threat. This is not metaphor. This is not hyperbole. This is a statistical observation made across several thousand years of recorded human conflict. The Terran coalition did not send 1,100 ships to demonstrate military capability. They sent 1,100 ships because 1,100 ships was what they had. If they had 11,000, they would have sent 11,000. This is the point that all previous analyses have missed. The fleet size was not strategic. It was logistical. They sent everything that could move because the concept of enough does not exist in this context. Final recommendation: do not touch the children, under any circumstances, for any reason. This is not a diplomatic recommendation. This is a survival recommendation. The document was distributed to every member of the Keth High Senate, all fleet admirals, and every intelligence director in the Dominion. It was also, through channels that were never officially acknowledged, transmitted to the governments of 37 other spacefaring civilizations. Most of them already knew. Most of them had, for 300 years, been trying to find a diplomatic way to say exactly what that document said, without being asked why they knew it so well. A few of them, in private, admitted to their own historians that they had learned the hard way, early in their contact with humanity, and had considered it impolite to warn others. Some things, they reasoned, a civilization needed to discover for itself. It was a lesson, after all, that only needed to be learned once. Back on Kepler 7, on an agricultural colony that was still rebuilding its sense of safety, a small girl named Cass was asleep in her own bed, in her own room, in her family's house on the edge of a field of grain that stretched all the way to the horizon. Her stuffed animal was tucked under her arm. Her mother was sitting in the chair beside the bed, watching her sleep, the way parents do when they have been afraid and are no longer afraid, but cannot quite convince their body of that fact yet. Outside the window the stars were bright and quiet. Far away, in the cold dark between star systems, In throne rooms and senate chambers and military briefing rooms across 42 Keth-controlled worlds, people were still talking about what had happened, still analyzing it, still writing reports and filing assessments and updating threat matrices. The stars did not care. They had watched humanity for a long time, long enough to know that this was not a new story. It was the oldest story, and it always ended the same way.